in love. This was a fresh start.
A new marriage.
Pi falling in love with my mom and taking on her 3 kids too.
A new chance for happiness.
You knew that you could grow up and live there forever.
But fairy tale romances rarely have fairy tale endings.
Her symptoms continued to escalate.
I was afraid to eat or drink anything.
A family is being terrorized by someone closer than they could imagine.
He felt that I can do this and get away with it. I'm that smart.
We were dealing with a heartless creature.
You might say there's 2 Floridas. One where tourists come to frolic, and another where hard-working people grow oranges, serve in the military, and raise families. Alturas is one of those places, a speck on the map, dead center of the state.
Alturas is a great little town. It's a very close-knit community. Everybody knows each other, and it's a great place to live and a great place to raise a family.
For Peggy and her new husband, Pi, it seems like the perfect place to blend their 2 families.
When I went there for the first time to see the house, I could see us all being a family there and enjoying, you know, the home there.
Is it a little cool?
Pi Carr's a phosphate miner who has lived here for more than a decade. Raising 2 teenagers as a single dad, he's just convinced Peggy to leave a nearby small town and move in with him, bringing her 3 kids along.
I appreciated Pi for what he was doing, you know, falling in love with my mom and taking on her 3 kids too, and offering to blend us all together. And I like Pi. I like Pi a lot.
The new Peggy and Pi household is a happy bunch. Pi's kids are Tammy and Travis. Peggy's are Dwayne, Alan, and Jelena. And Peggy's also a grandma. Jelena is a single mom with a 2-year-old daughter named Casey. For Peggy and Pi, it's been a whirlwind romance.
My mom had a restaurant in Fort Meade, and he would come in and he would kind of flirt with her a little bit and ask me to introduce him.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give it to her.
At first, she didn't really want anything to do with him. She wasn't interested, and then, I don't know, I think he just kind of kept being persistent, and finally, she said yes.
From there, things moved quickly for the happy couple. And everyone in the area was delighted to have their whole gang in our midst.
This was a fresh start. They seemed really in love, and we were excited for Mom. I think all of us were excited about the move, excited about the change. We started making friends right away.
For Peggy and her children, it seems like everything is finally coming together.
Alturas was a very safe place to live. The people there were all friends, everybody knew each other, and you knew that you could grow up and love and live there forever.
But all the love and warm feelings are put to the test when evil descends on the neighborhood. For now, though, it's nothing but sunshine for Pi Carr's new clan. They are welcomed by George and Diana Trapal, who've lived next door to Pi for half a dozen years. George is a computer whiz who works at home. Diana is a successful orthopedic surgeon.
We all knew that she was a doctor, so we wanted to respect her and like her right away.
George and Diana don't have children, and they place a lot of value on privacy and quiet. But that's a tall order, with 5 kids across the way.
I was a typical teenager. Dwayne and I, and Travis too, we were always working on our cars. We were always fixing motorcycles, cars, whatever.
Teens hanging out in the yard, a big, joyous family. For Peggy, it's a dream come true, even if the noise levels might be a little trying for the folks next door.
You know what? Before we dig in, let's just all hold hands for a minute. Right now.
I think she enjoyed having a house full of people, a house full of kids. My mom really expected us to have dinner together. That was one of the rules. So we would all sit around and laugh and joke and talk.
The best news for Peggy is that her kids and Pies become fast friends.
Me and Tammy hit it off right away. I was honored to have a sister. I really, really liked the fact that I had another brother, and they just made it easy to be their sibling.
We seemed to blend real well.
George and Pie have always been cordial, if never close. In the entire time they've been neighbors, only once has there been serious friction.
There had been a confrontation over the Carr's dogs chasing the Tripal's cats.
But things were resolved, and, in any case, Pie's dogs died of a strange illness soon afterwards. Since then, it's all been peace and harmony between the two men.
Can you wave hi to George?
My first impression of George when I saw him, I remember he used to wear sandals with socks, and I thought that was very nerdy. But I thought he was nice, because he would wave at us.
Soon, though, the growing household next door proves to be too much for George.
Pie said that he'd take the pool house and make it into a 2-bedroom apartment for me and my stepsister, Tammy.
The renovation drives their neighbor crazy.
Down, my wife's trying to sleep in the house.
I'm sorry, I'm doing renovations.
I understand that, but you're cutting all the time. It's so loud.
George didn't really approve of that, didn't like that, but that Pie didn't really care. And I think that's the kind of person Pie was. He was just very, I'm gonna do it whether you like it or not.
I can't help you. I gotta get this done.
Before the reno is complete, George calls a city inspector, who shuts the project down. With one phone call, he has managed to foil his neighbor's plans.
Who complained?
I don't really know why he had such a problem with that.
You gotta be kidding.
The houses aren't that close together.
Soon there are other signs of trouble. Inside the house, Pie and Peggy's fairy tale romance is starting to develop some cracks.
About 4 months into the marriage, we started seeing my mom and Pie argue.
I didn't do anything.
What do you mean you didn't do anything? I already had to go through this in my past. I don't need it again from you. Just stay there. I don't want you to touch me.
No, I didn't do anything.
And outside, the neighbors escalate the clampdown on their disturbed peace.
Turn that music down right now! What is going on here?
Diana was always complaining. She was always unhappy.
You guys have no regard for other people, okay? But
Diane came outside and wanted to yell and insisted on talking to my mom.
keep other
Diana, what seems to be the problem?
Oh, what seems to be the problem? Your boys are out of control. That's what the problem is. This music.
You know, this lady just blasted Mom, and Mom didn't swear. She wouldn't say anything hateful or anything back. She would only try to explain. They're just being boys. They're just washing their vehicle. I'll get them to turn the music down, and she would try to appease this lady.
This is a disturbance.
Look,
The
you need to
entire
calm
neighborhood,
down.
okay?
Finally, Peggy snaps.
Get off my property. Now.
How dare you?
Peggy was a very sweet woman. At the same time, she wasn't the type of person who was going to be walked on. She was not going to allow people to upset her family or upset her life, that she's going to stand up for herself.
For Peggy, the tension is getting unbearable. There's angry neighbors next door, and a new marriage that's turning out to be less wonderful than she thought.
My mom revealed to me that she had some suspicion of Pie cheating, and she was very upset about that.
Why? How could you do this to me?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Come on,
The relationship deteriorates, and attempts at reconciliation falter.
stay away
And I was
from me,
hurt
okay?
because I'm the one who introduced him to my mother. So I felt like not only did he disappoint and hurt my mother, but he disappointed and hurt me.
With her dreams of happiness hanging by a thread, and the Trapals next door watching her family's every move, the last thing Peggy needs is more trouble. But she's about to get it in spades.
I thought she had the flu. She said that she was tired, she was sick to her stomach.
Peggy's known as a hard worker, but today, she can't finish her shift.
One thing that I felt was odd and out of character for the flu was that she said she couldn't open her eyes. Her eyelids were very heavy, and she felt burning in her feet and in her hands.
Her symptoms continued to escalate to the point where she couldn't even walk. She had become so incredibly weak that she was just not able to do anything for herself.
Her family is about to learn this is only the beginning of their plunge into hell.
Cars had actually received a note that said, you need to get out of Florida or you're all going to die.
My brother, he goes, "Sis, I feel sick. My hands are tingling and on fire, and I can't hardly walk."
It's like everything stops. It changes everything.
Peggy Carr has come down with a strange illness. She's seen a doctor and been sent back home. But now she's getting worse by the day, and her children are frantic.
I remember just kind of pushing Pi. You know, we need to take my mom back to the ER. We need to take her to the hospital.
Curiously, Peggy's husband Pi has a better idea. He invites his sister over. Carolyn's a nurse.
Carolyn kept giving her cola and trying to make sure that my mom drank a lot of fluids. I felt like Carolyn was not a doctor, she was a nurse. And I felt like she needed to go see a doctor.
Finally, no one can ignore how sick Peggy has become.
Pi finally came down to my apartment and said, "I'm gonna take your mom to the hospital. I think she needs to go." They admitted her because they thought she had some kind of viral infection.
Doctors can't figure out exactly what is wrong with her. All they know is that this tough, hard-working 42-year-old woman is completely incapacitated.
I was in class in the Navy and got an emergency message. I flew into Orlando and met Jelena. I knew it was serious when Jelena told me we were going straight to the hospital. We weren't going anywhere else.
Exhaustive tests are run, and the cause of Peggy's illness is finally discovered. It's a massive shock to everyone.
The doctor, I can remember his face as clear as if it were yesterday.
What we've discovered is there is a poison in her system.
And he tells you that it's a heavy metal poisoning.
Peggy's been poisoned with thallium nitrate, a compound last used in the 50s and 60s in rat poison.
What goes through your mind is, what does it take to get her out of here? What's got to happen now? Do I have to give blood, or does she need something from me? How can I help her? There's got to be something I can do.
But the next piece of news is even more devastating. Thallium poisoning has no antidote, and the horror doesn't stop there. Soon, half the family is sick. First, Peggy's son, Dwayne. Then Pi's son, Travis, develops the symptoms too.
I remember asking Dwayne, what does it feel like? He just described like needle pricks on all of his extremities.
The thallium had been pulled from the shelves years ago and was no longer available, which left authorities trying to find where this rat poison had came from. The first place they looked was in the wells, and there was extreme concern that the water system in that area may have become contaminated.
Next-door neighbors George and Diana Trapal share a well with Pi. They've been told that thallium is tasteless, odorless, and deadly.
They were very vigilant. They started drinking bottled water. They were concerned that if it could have happened to her, it could happen to us.
But the wells are clean. Police now think someone has deliberately poisoned Peggy and her family. But who could it possibly be? Investigators are stunned to learn that Pi's family had recently been the target of a death threat.
We found out during our investigation is that the cars had actually received a note, like a typed note, several weeks before.
And it said, you and your so-called family all need to move out of the state of Florida or you will all be killed.
The family laughed it off and didn't report it to police. A bad call in hindsight. Authorities now scour Pi's house for clues.
I believe there was over 400 items that were taken from their house and sent to the lab to be tested.
Soon, they discover how the deadly thallium had entered the home. One of the items sent for testing was a half-empty six-pack of cola.
The lab actually found high doses in the bottles that were left, high doses of thallium.
So they traced it back to the bottling plant and reviewed that bottling plant from top to bottom and never could find any reason to believe that that was the source.
It was determined that these bottles were molested. You know, they were tampered with.
And police think they know who might have done it.
Law enforcement began looking at Pi car.
Detective Ernie Mincy learns that Pi's marriage is strained. And that he was conveniently away when Peggy fell ill.
Got Pi, who all of a sudden is elusive now. You know, he's not around, he's not standing beside you. When you and Jelena are talking to the doctor, Pi is nowhere to be found, and they started to suspect that there was something else going on.
I had heard that he had life insurance on my mom. The fact that my mom thought he had been cheating. He didn't want to take her to the hospital. So I immediately thought that Pi had poisoned our family.
But one thing doesn't add up for Mincy. Everyone who knows Pi knows he loves his son, Travis.
Travis had become very ill, and he was probably the most ill after Peggy and was hospitalized. And the question remained, why would Pi do that to his own son?
And then I thought, well, maybe Travis accidentally got poisoned.
Without proof, police quickly reach an impasse.
They decided to contact the FBI and get their behavioral analysis unit involved to come up with a profile of who they were looking for.
The FBI sends one of their best, Bill Hagmeyer, who helped solve the infamous Ted Bundy case.
It's sort of new on the scene. But
two flags went up right away. Somebody has something against this particular family, and someone's in a position to know when they can get that poison into their house without being seen.
As he builds a profile of the poisoner, Hegmeyer highlights the significance of thallium.
They were doing a review of 8,000 homicides, and only 8 were poisonings, and none of them were thallium. Well, thallium as a weapons choice would reflect that it's someone who has a background in chemistry.
It's clear the perpetrator is highly skilled at disguising his work.
8 of them were from poisoning.
I can recall our lab technician telling me how impressed they were that this was put into the bottle, and the cap, these were the metal caps that were clip-ons at that time by pressure. They had difficulty in finding any tool mark evidence on it.
For Hegmeyer, the poisoner's most dangerous quality is his moral character, or complete lack of it.
Thallium's extremely dangerous. An overdose of it would probably eliminate you pretty quickly, but the real frightening part of this is it's the type of poison that takes its toll over a period of time. They were going to punish these persons. It was one of the more vile things I've seen done because it has an effect of hair falling out, organs declining, failure of physiological systems.
Watching this crime play out.
It was like they were taking some joy out of not only killing people, but watching them die in misery. And that's not common to see that.
In other words, somewhere nearby, maybe even in your own home, a psychopath is lurking.
I was afraid to eat or drink anything because I didn't know who had poisoned us.
And there's no telling where he'll stop.
I felt like I was in a fog, you know, not really understanding what's going on, but trying to focus on taking care of my brother and my mom.
A month after being poisoned, Peggy Carr slips into a coma. It devastates her children.
It changes everything. You think, who cares about the military? Your world stops right there.
The whole family lives on high alert.
I was afraid to eat or drink anything because I didn't know who had poisoned us. I didn't know who would want to hurt our family in that way.
The poisoner really felt that, hey, I can do this and get away with it. I'm that smart.
As they piece together the crime, law enforcement realizes how much planning it would have taken to pull it off.
It had to be someone who was familiar with the going and comings of this particular family. That's extremely important.
The poisoner watched closely and learned the family's favorite drink. Most types of thallium are volatile, but the assailant found one version, thallium nitrate, that served his dark purpose. He carefully loaded a 6-pack of cola with poison and planted his deadly weapon in the Carr's house without being seen. It's a work of daring genius.
With that choice of a weapon, they believe that they're probably brighter than law enforcement, and it would be very difficult for us to identify it, much less trace it back to its source.
Well, that would explain why.
After hundreds of interviews with neighbors and friends of the family, police have a profile of the perpetrator, but no actual suspect.
We don't see a lot of motive anywhere. Some small problems within the family, small problems with the neighbors, but nothing that would rise to the level of murder.
Unless Pye's neighbors didn't see their problems with his family as small, but rather something that warranted extreme retaliation. Detective Mincy pores over the case file, and something new jumps out at him. Neighbor George Trapal's complaint about Pye's dogs 4 years earlier, and their subsequent death shortly afterwards.
When we learned about dogs dying and how their hair was falling out, they probably just assumed the dogs went out and ate something they shouldn't.
Now, police make a chilling connection. While Peggy lay in hospital in agony, her hair was falling out.
You wouldn't think, that somebody would go to these extremes over dogs chasing cats, but obviously with this case, it tends to think they were possibly poisoned as well.
FBI profiler Bill Hagmeyer wonders if a lesson he learned from a previous case applies to George Trepal.
As Ted Bundy once said, once you cross that line, it's much easier to do it the next time.
Detective Ernie Mincy decides to pay George a friendly visit. His host is surprisingly chatty.
Why would anybody want to do this?
To get them to move?
That resonated with Ernie Mincy. He remembered back to the note that had been left at the Carr family home that said, "You need to move out."
When Mincy runs a background check on George, he makes an alarming discovery.
In the 1970s, he had actually been sent to prison. He was a chemist. He was actually cooking methamphetamine. And he had been busted, manufacturing methamphetamine. One of the chemicals that can be used in that is thallium.
The detective now knows that George has the skills to use the poison that's killing Peggy Carr.
So we're starting to get even more suspicion towards Mr. Trepal at that point.
And he learns something else about George's time in prison. While inside, he launched an official complaint about his fellow inmates. Their music was too loud.
Turn that music down right now! My husband and I are at home. We can't even hear ourselves think.
It seems more than another intriguing coincidence, but there is still no physical evidence tying George to the crime.
He had been interviewed. He was not going to slip up. They felt that his intellect was such that he was going to be careful about what he said.
Detective Hagmeyer sees only one way to get George, an undercover agent.
Most of us have two weaknesses if we're men, and one is sex and one is ego.
They felt that the only way they were going to get George was if they went undercover.
The assignment falls to Detective Susan Gorick. Her job, befriend a man who may be a monster.
Susan put her life in jeopardy to conduct this investigation.
At any given moment, he could have figured out what was going on, and she could have been in tremendous danger.
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
The doctors came and told us that they didn't think that my mom was going to make it and that we needed to take her off the ventilator.
Poisoned with deadly thallium, Peggy Carr has been in a coma for 4 months. Finally, her family makes the difficult decision.
You look down and that's not your mom. You have to kind of consider her suffering and consider what the doctors told you.
With the flick of a switch, this poisoning becomes a murder investigation. Angelina has a strong suspicion of where police should look.
How could you? How could you do this?
I knew the fact that my mom thought I had been cheating. And I felt like he didn't want to take her to the hospital when I thought he should. I just had my mind set that Pi was the one who did this.
But police believe their suspect is next-door neighbor George Trepal, driven to kill simply because the Carr family made too much noise. Detective Susan Gorick studies the man she must now befriend.
So we thought if we employed an undercover female to try to gain his confidence, to try to establish rapport with him, that we might have him let down his guard.
But figuring out how to get close to George takes months. The investigation seems to be going nowhere, and it's killing Jelena. Detective Ernie Mincy can't tell her that the man in their sights is her neighbor without jeopardizing the case.
I need answers right now on what happened to my mom.
Me and Ernie had gotten into quite a bit of a heated argument, and Susan came up and she gave me a hug. I said, I just want to know who did this to my mom, and she said, we're going to find out who did this.
To set up the sting, police learn everything they can about George Trapal. They discover that George and Diana are members of an elite society, Mensa.
Mensa is an organization for people who are highly intelligent. I believe it's the top 1% of the population.
That gives law enforcement the opening they've been looking for.
Well, we find an article in a newspaper where Diane and George Trapal are holding a murder mystery weekend for Mensa members. Basically, they're going to host this. It's going to be a weekend long of murder mystery.
They would stage a murder, and then they would leave clues around, and then it would be up to the members to find out who committed the murder.
The plan is for Detective Susan Gorick to infiltrate the event.
She was able to do the undercover work to present herself as Sherry Gwynn, a woman who's running from an estranged husband who's abusive, who she basically doesn't have any help, and George is there to give her that help.
Susan, posing as Sherry Gwynn, writes George an eager letter asking to attend the murder mystery night. She adds a revealing personal detail. Her despised ex-husband is an attorney.
We had learned through some of the background that George Trapal did not like attorneys. So we had this backfilled story of, hey, she's just moving here. She's running from this attorney husband who's making life a living hell for her, and she needs some help. So it gives George a chance to basically be the knight in shining armor.
George falls for the ruse and invites Susan to the event. He sends her a package to help her prepare. It's a humorous pamphlet that lays out how the first character might be killed.
In there, George or Diane, they're talking about a murder that's been done by poisoning. She makes reference in there as to, you should move away. You should throw food and drink that's in your house away if you're being threatened by poisoning. So a lot of things here are paralleling the real life investigation.
There's crackers over there.
Please help yourself.
Cheers.
When the big night arrives, a nervous Susan makes sure to flatter her host to gain his favor.
We needed George to be the dominant personality, a role he wasn't normally used to in interaction with females in all probability.
The goals at that point were just to try and get introduced to George or Diane, to become part of their life, to gain some of their trust.
Tonight, everyone is acting, including the evening's first victim. As the guests search for clues in the pretend murder case, police realize they're on the right track in the real one.
We knew from our research that people that are poisoners were people who lived in fantasy worlds, who thought about these crimes. We can't say someone's innocent or guilty, but as this case was developing, it just gave more and more support that the investigators were onto the right person.
Susan's effort to ingratiate herself with her hosts is successful and leads to a chance to get even closer.
I love this place. This house is just so beautiful.
Thank you. Actually, we're thinking of moving.
Really? Mm-hmm. Would you be interested in selling?
Finding out that they were going to move gave us an opportunity to change the scenario and make a right turn. Let Sherry explain to them that I got to get away from my husband. I'm not going to live with him. I got to find another place to live in a hurry. We were hoping that George would see this as a mirror of his own situation with our family, that there was a source of aggravation that could not be escaped, and at some point it had to be removed.
George reacts as hoped. He reveals a vast collection of murder mystery books. These, he implies, are where Susan can find the answer to her ex-husband problems.
By means of giving her literature, there was no doubt he was giving her advice indirectly, and he had determined that she was bright enough to catch on. He basically was telling her how to eliminate your husband.
Susan's new friend thinks he's found a kindred spirit. He doesn't know. He's just stepped into her trap.
Law enforcement was crawling all over that property, just checking every nook and corner to see what evidence they could find.
I wanted to know who did it, and I wanted to know who did it now.
It's been more than a year since Peggy Carr was poisoned and died a slow and painful death. Her family still doesn't know who's responsible. However, Jelena still suspects her stepfather.
We were not allowed to be in the house because at that time it was a crime scene. So we had to find other places to live.
Peggy's son, Dwayne, is finally well enough to be released from hospital. But Pi has not only lost his wife to poison, his son, Travis, is still terribly ill. It seems that George Trapal's plan has worked. He's destroyed the family next door. Their place is finally quiet.
I don't think there was any doubt in George's mind that he had contrived and executed the perfect crime.
The Trapals move to a new house, but decide not to sell their old one to undercover agent Susan Gorick, posing as their new friend, Sherry Gwynn. Had they done so, she could have searched it for evidence. Now that chance is gone.
We don't have a lot of hard evidence at this time. All we have is a poisoning, and we've got a guy who's made some strange comments and had a murder mystery weekend. So could we have gotten a search warrant? I don't think we could have at that point.
But Susan isn't giving up. If she can't buy his old house, maybe there's another way in. She has George meet her for lunch.
I'm good. How are you?
See you.
Good to see you.
She plants the seed of, hey, I need a place to live. Maybe I could rent your house.
The fate of the investigation hangs on George's decision.
Really glad that you...
George takes the bait. I mean, he takes it and it works out perfectly. Now we're allowed to move into this house. We don't need a search warrant.
Within hours of Susan renting George's property, crime scene technicians move in.
We're going through everything. I mean, we're just like we did with the Carr's house. It's time to send everything off and test it. Let's see what we can find.
Now police want to spook their suspect and gauge his reaction.
We basically had to load the gun with more ammunition. In other words, what we needed to do was to get him to respond.
How's Diana?
Oh, she's fine.
Susan calls George again. She tells him police have come around, inquiring about his possible connection to a crime.
They question me about some stuff and about you.
I think George is sweating bullets at this particular moment. He's not used to this kind of stress.
This is all very strange. If they're interested in me, it would be because of the probably poisoning next door to you.
George is reacting. What did Sherry give them? What's my recourse here? They're talking to her. What does she know?
George invites Susan to visit his new home in a nearby town. That's one proposition she needs to turn down.
We'll be if they turn off.
George is thinking Sherry's value in my life may have expired. I can't allow a threat to exist to my freedom.
Listen, stay in touch and let me know.
Somebody that's coming in their house may not come back out.
Afternoon.
Finally, the forensic team at George's old place hits the jackpot.
One of the bottles we find in the house, we send it off to the lab, and it comes back with thallium. The same type of poison used as our murder weapon.
That is exactly what we were looking for.
Well, now we're like, we've got him. You know, we're there.
For police, there is no doubt. George Trepal is Peggy Carr's killer. That night, they descend on his new home. George is arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Searching his new house, authorities find more evidence tying him to the crime.
They discovered a book that described different kinds of chemicals. And included in that book was a chapter on thallium. They processed that for fingerprints and found on that particular page, it was just laden with George's fingerprints. They also found a secret room in the basement of the new house that had been made soundproof. The window had been obscured.
I think Detective Gorick, I think she kind of had a question at that point, hey, was this room maybe meant for me?
At last, Detective Mincy can tell Peggy's children they've made an arrest in their mother's killing.
It was your neighbor, George.
We arrested him last night. And I was like, you have the wrong person. Ernie, he did not do this. He was nice. He would wave at me.
I never suspected him. It's like being betrayed by a friend.
This is a perfect example of a monster living next door.
George is tried for the murder of Peggy Carr and the attempted murder of her family. There's no evidence his wife was involved, and she is never charged.
We, the jury, find the defendant, George J. Trepal, guilty of first-degree murder.
Judge Maloney sentenced George Trepal to death for the death of Peggy Carr.
For Peggy's children, life would never be the same.
I think it made me and my brothers closer. I think it made us a little weary of who we trust.
Dwayne will need more than a year to fully recover from his poisoning. Travis feels the effects to this day.
The desert keeps secrets better than any locked room. In the summer of 1993, just outside a stretch of highway that cut through the sunburnt emptiness of Arizona, a car was found abandoned. Engine cold, driver's door half open, as if whoever stepped out thought they'd be back in seconds. They never were. No signs of struggle. No blood. No footprints leading anywhere that made sense. Just silence. Endless, suffocating silence. Her name was Laura Bennett, 27. No criminal record. No known enemies. A waitress at a roadside diner where truckers passed through and forgot faces as quickly as they ordered coffee. To most, she was invisible, until she vanished. And suddenly, she was everywhere. Headlines, posters, whispers that crawled through the town like a slow disease. Arizona 1993 cold case, the papers would later call it. But back then it wasn't cold. It was burning. Burning through every rumor, every late-night conversation, every police report that piled higher with nothing solid inside. The night she disappeared, Laura had finished her shift at 11:42 p.m. That detail stuck. Precise. Measured. A timestamp that felt important, like it should unlock something if you stared at it long enough. She told a coworker she was tired, said she'd go straight home, said she hated driving alone at night because the desert felt like it was watching her. She never made it. Her car was found 17 miles away from the diner, angled awkwardly on the side of Route 89. No skid marks. No sign of mechanical failure. The keys still in the ignition. Her purse untouched on the passenger seat. Cash inside. ID. Everything exactly where it should be, except Laura. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. The second came quickly after. A truck driver reported seeing the car around midnight. Said it was already there. said he thought it was strange, but not strange enough to stop. In Arizona, strange things happen in the desert. You learn not to ask questions. You learn to keep driving. But then came the third detail, the one that would haunt investigators for decades. A set of tire tracks, not from Laura's car, parked briefly behind her vehicle, then gone. No registration match. No witnesses who could describe it clearly. Just a ghost vehicle that appeared for minutes and vanished without a trace. Police canvassed the area. Helicopters swept the desert. Volunteers walked mile after mile under a punishing sun that seemed determined to erase every clue before it could be found. Nothing. No body. No clothing. No disturbance in the terrain. It was as if Laura Bennett had stepped out of her car and dissolved into air. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The headlines shifted. New crimes replaced old fears. But in that town, something lingered. Something unresolved. People started talking. A man at the diner who came in every Thursday and never ordered the same thing twice. A customer who asked Laura too many questions the week before she disappeared. A local mechanic who claimed he saw a second car that night. A dark sedan, engine running, lights off. But every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Descriptions didn't match. Timelines didn't align. Memories changed. And then the case went quiet. Not solved. Not closed. Just quiet. A cold case. Filed away in a cabinet where dust settled thicker each year, where detectives retired or moved on, where evidence sat untouched, waiting for something, anything, to bring it back to life. And for nearly 3 decades, nothing did. Until a name resurfaced. Not in a police report. Not in a forensic breakthrough. But in a whispered confession that came too late, from someone who had spent years convincing themselves they had imagined it, or worse, chosen to forget. A long-lost witness. Someone who had been there. Someone who had seen something that didn't fit the official story. And when they finally spoke, everything changed. The name didn't appear in any report from 1993. Not in the initial canvass. Not in the follow-ups. Not even in the stack of anonymous tips that flooded the station in the weeks after Laura Bennett vanished. It surfaced quietly, almost reluctantly, nearly 30 years later, like something pulled from deep water, warped by time, but still dangerous. Daniel Harker. At first, it meant nothing. No criminal record. No outstanding warrants. No obvious connection to Laura, to the diner, or to Route 89. Just a man in his 50s living 2 states away, working a job that required him to stay invisible, night shifts, minimal contact, the kind of life where no one asks questions because no one expects answers. But what he said that was different. He didn't call the police. He didn't walk into a station and confess. The story slipped out during something smaller, something almost forgettable, a recorded interview for a local podcast focused on unsolved cases. The host had reached out to dozens of people tied loosely to Arizona in the early 90s, chasing ghosts, hoping for anything. Most gave vague answers. Some didn't respond at all. Daniel did. At first, he sounded uncertain, his voice low, strained, like every word had to fight its way out. I think I saw something back then. I didn't realize what it was. Not until years later. That sentence alone was enough to make the host pause. Because this wasn't just any unsolved case. This was the Arizona 1993 cold case, the one with no body, no suspect, no ending. And suddenly there was a witness. Daniel claimed that on the night Laura disappeared, he had been driving south on Route 89, heading back from a construction job that ran late. He remembered the heat lingering even after midnight, the kind that clings to your skin, makes the air feel thick, unmoving. He remembered the road being empty. Too empty. Until it wasn't. He saw the car first, Laura's car, parked at an odd angle, headlights off. That detail stuck with him. In the desert, at night, people don't sit in darkness unless something is wrong. He slowed down. And then he saw the second vehicle. A dark sedan, positioned just behind hers, almost touching. Engine running. No lights. Like it didn't want to be seen. At the time, he told himself it was none of his business. Maybe a breakdown. Maybe someone helping. Maybe something he didn't want to get involved in. But then he saw movement. A figure near the driver's side of Laura's car. Not standing. Struggling. That was the word he used. Not walking. Not leaning. Struggling. And another figure, larger, harder to make out in the dark, pulling, forcing, controlling the movement. Daniel didn't stop. That was the part that came out slowest, like it physically hurt to admit. I just kept driving. The host asked why. Silence stretched across the recording. Long enough to feel uncomfortable. Long enough to feel real. Because I thought if I stopped I might not leave. That answer changed everything. Because for decades, investigators had one assumption they couldn't shake. That whatever happened to Laura, it happened quickly, quietly, without witnesses. Now that assumption was gone. Replaced by something darker. She hadn't just vanished. She had been taken. The podcast episode aired quietly, like all the others. No major promotion. No expectation of impact. Just another story in a long list of unsolved mysteries. But someone was listening. A retired detective who had worked the original case. He recognized the details immediately, the angle of the car, the positioning described in early photographs never released to the public, the mention of a second vehicle that had been dismissed due to lack of corroboration. Details Daniel shouldn't have known. Details that had been buried. Within 48 hours, the recording was in the hands of investigators. Within a week, Daniel Harker was sitting in an interview room under fluorescent lights that made everything look harsher, more exposed. He looked older than his voice suggested. Tired in a way that didn't come from age alone. The kind of exhaustion built over years of carrying something unspoken. They asked him to tell the story again. This time, he didn't hold back. He described the figures more clearly now, not because his memory improved, but because he had spent years replaying that moment, sharpening it, forcing it into focus. The smaller figure, Laura, was resisting. He was sure of that now. Arms moving erratically. Body twisting. Not the behavior of someone willingly getting into another car. The larger figure kept pulling her toward the sedan. At one point, she broke free. That was the detail that made the room go still. She ran, Daniel said. Just for a second. Toward the road. Toward him. He admitted he had slowed even more then, his foot hovering over the brake. For a fraction of time, their paths almost crossed. He could have stopped. Could have opened the door. Could have changed everything. But he didn't. Because the second figure caught her. Fast. Efficient. Like it wasn't the first time. And then nothing. The struggle disappeared behind the shadow of the vehicles. The desert swallowed the sound. The road stretched ahead, empty again. Daniel drove on. And for 30 years, he said nothing. Investigators pressed him on every detail. The car, the figures, the timing, the exact location. They cross-referenced his account with old reports, photographs, even satellite data from that era, looking for anything that aligned. And it did. Too well. The tire tracks found behind Laura's car. The angle of her vehicle. The estimated window of disappearance. For the first time in decades, the case had something solid. Not a theory. Not a rumor. A witness. But it came with a new problem. If Daniel had seen the abduction, then whoever took Laura had been exposed, if only for a moment. Which meant one of two things. Either they believed no one was watching, or they were confident that even if someone was, it wouldn't matter. And that kind of confidence doesn't come from chance. It comes from experience. Or from knowing the system won't catch you. Investigators reopened every file connected to Route 89 in the early 90s. Every report of suspicious vehicles. Every missing persons case within a 200-mile radius. Every name that had surfaced briefly and then disappeared into paperwork. Patterns began to emerge. Not clear ones. Not enough to point to a single suspect, but enough to suggest this wasn't isolated. Enough to raise a question that had never been fully considered before. What if Laura Bennett wasn't the only one? The desert had always been vast, unforgiving, perfect for hiding things that didn't want to be found. Now it felt like it had been hiding something far worse. And Daniel Harker, whether he realized it or not, had just opened the door. The moment a cold case breathes again, everything changes, but not in the way people expect. It doesn't explode into clarity. It tightens. The air in the room gets heavier. Every detail that once felt distant suddenly presses in, sharper, louder, more demanding. And in Laura Bennett's case, the past didn't just return, it started to rearrange itself. Detectives pulled the old boxes from storage, the ones stamped with fading ink and dated signatures from officers who no longer wore badges, some no longer alive. Paper cracked at the edges as files were reopened, photographs sliding out like fragments of a story that had never been finished. Route 89. Mile marker estimates. Grainy images of Laura's car under harsh flash lighting, frozen in the exact position it had been found. Driver's door ajar, interior untouched, the stillness almost staged. But now, those photos looked different. Now, they weren't documenting a disappearance. They were documenting a crime in progress, interrupted only by time. Daniel Harker's testimony didn't just add a piece to the puzzle. It shifted the entire frame. What had once been a question of what happened became something far more dangerous. Who was bold enough to do it out in the open? And that question led investigators somewhere they had avoided for decades. Back then, the working theory had leaned toward opportunity, wrong place, wrong time, a random encounter on a deserted highway. It was the easiest explanation, the cleanest, the one that required the fewest unknowns. Now it felt naive, because Daniel's account suggested control, speed, precision, the kind of execution that doesn't come from panic. It comes from repetition. Someone had done this before. The task force, newly assembled from a mix of veteran detectives and younger analysts raised on digital forensics, began reconstructing the night minute by minute. They built timelines layered with old witness statements, phone records that had been overlooked, traffic estimates, even weather reports from that exact date in 1993. The heat had lingered past midnight. Wind minimal. Visibility clear. Perfect conditions. Too perfect. They mapped Daniel's route against Laura's last known movements. Calculated distances. Estimated speeds. Ran simulations that replayed the sequence over and over again. Car stopping, second vehicle arriving, encounter escalating, abduction executed. Each version ended the same way. Laura disappeared in under 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was all it took. And in those 2 minutes, not a single verified witness stepped forward. Until now. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the patterns became. Reports from nearby counties surfaced, scattered, inconsistent, easy to dismiss on their own. A woman claiming she was followed late at night along a similar stretch of road. A stalled vehicle with no driver found abandoned weeks before Laura vanished. A call logged by a highway patrol officer who noted suspicious activity involving a dark sedan parked behind another car, then clearing the scene before he could approach. At the time, none of it connected. Now it refused to stay separate. The phrase started circulating quietly within the investigation, never officially stated, but impossible to ignore. Serial behavior. Not confirmed, not proven, but hovering there, shaping every decision, every theory. Because if Laura Bennett wasn't the first, then someone had been moving through that desert with confidence for longer than anyone realized. And maybe they never stopped. Attention turned back to the diner, the last place Laura had been seen alive. Detectives revisited employee records, customer logs, anything that could place a recurring presence in her orbit. Faces that came and went, names that meant nothing at the time, but now demanded scrutiny. One stood out. Not because it was suspicious, but because it was forgettable. A man listed only as cash customer on multiple late-night receipts. No card. No ID. Always paid in bills. Always sat near the far end of the counter. And according to 2 separate co-workers interviewed in 1993, he had asked about Laura. Not in an obvious way. Not enough to raise alarm. Just enough to linger in memory. Does she always work this late? That was the question one of them remembered. Casual. Almost polite. Back then, it meant nothing. Now it felt like surveillance. The problem was there was no name. No plate number. No clear description. Just fragments. Average height. Dark clothing. A voice that didn't stand out. A man designed to be forgotten. But Daniel's account added something new. Size. The second figure he saw, the one who took Laura, was larger, broader, strong enough to overpower her quickly. That detail narrowed the field, but not enough. Investigators began cross-referencing employment records from construction sites, trucking routes, and temporary labor crews active in the area during that time. Men who worked nights. Men who moved frequently. Men who wouldn't be noticed if they left town suddenly. Hundreds of names. Then dozens. Then a handful that didn't quite fit. One of them had been questioned briefly in 1993, and then released. His name surfaced like a glitch in the system, buried in an appendix of the original report, barely 2 paragraphs long. A routine stop. A man found parked near Route 89 days before Laura disappeared. Claimed he was resting. Said he got lost. No warrants. No cause to detain him further. At the time, it was nothing. Now it was everything. Because his vehicle matched the description Daniel had given. Dark sedan. Older model. Engine issues noted in the report, meaning it may have needed to idle frequently. A detail that aligned too perfectly. Investigators tracked the name through decades of records, addresses that changed, jobs that started and ended without pattern, a life that seemed to drift just outside the edges of stability. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to avoid scrutiny. Until now. But when they tried to locate him in the present day, they hit another wall. He was gone. Not missing. Not deceased. Just gone. No recent employment. No updated address. No digital footprint to speak of. As if he had slowly erased himself over time, piece by piece, leaving behind only outdated records and unanswered questions. The kind of disappearance that felt deliberate. And that's when the case shifted again. Because for the first time, investigators weren't just chasing the past. They were chasing someone who might still be out there. Someone who had taken Laura Bennett in the dark, in under 2 minutes, on an empty stretch of desert road, and walked away clean. Someone who, for nearly 30 years, had lived with the certainty that no one saw. No one knew. No one would ever come looking. Until a man named Daniel Harker decided, decades too late, that silence was heavier than truth. And now, the desert wasn't the only thing holding secrets anymore. The name didn't stay buried for long. Once investigators pulled that forgotten report from 1993 and placed it side by side with Daniel Harker's statement, the alignment was impossible to ignore. What had once been background noise, an incidental stop, a routine interaction, now read like a warning no one understood at the time. The man had a name. Thomas Keegan. It didn't sound dangerous. It didn't carry weight. No headlines attached to it, no criminal history that would make anyone pause. In 1993, he was just another transient worker drifting through Arizona, construction, auto repair, occasional long-haul driving. The kind of man who existed on the edges of systems, not inside them. But the details refused to stay quiet. He had been stopped 3 nights before Laura disappeared. Parked off Route 89. Engine running. Lights off. That alone echoed Daniel's account with chilling precision. At the time, the officer noted nothing unusual beyond the setting. Keegan claimed he was resting, said he didn't like driving during the hottest parts of the day and preferred to move at night. His explanation fit the environment. In Arizona, that kind of behavior wasn't rare. So he was let go. No search. No follow-up. Just a name in a report that would sit untouched for decades. Now, every line of that report felt different. Investigators reconstructed Keegan's timeline with a level of scrutiny that hadn't existed in 1993. They tracked employment records, pieced together fragments from tax filings, old rental agreements, and interviews with people who barely remembered him. And that was the pattern. No one remembered him clearly. He kept to himself. That's all I can say. He was quiet, didn't cause trouble. It was always the same. Vague. Distant. Like trying to describe a shadow. But shadows don't disappear people. Somewhere in that silence, there had to be something more. They went back to the diner again, this time not looking for obvious connections, but for absence. For the spaces where memory failed, where details blurred. Because sometimes what people don't remember is just as important as what they do. One former employee hesitated. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden realization. Just a pause, slightly too long, when shown an old composite sketch from the early days of the investigation. I might have seen him, she said.
Might.
That word hung heavy. She described a man who sat alone, late hours, never stayed long, didn't speak much,
but watched.
Not in a way that triggered fear. Just enough to be noticed and then forgotten. Until now. The timeline tightened. If Keegan had been in the diner days before Laura disappeared, if he had been parked along Route 89 at night, if his vehicle matched the description given by Daniel, then the question shifted again. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Surveillance. Opportunity. Execution. The kind of sequence that suggested planning. And planning meant intent. Investigators pushed deeper, reopening cases that had once seemed unrelated. Missing persons reports from neighboring states. Unidentified remains found in remote desert areas. Incidents involving stranded motorists approached by unknown individuals. Patterns emerged, not clean, not perfect, but persistent. A dark vehicle. Late hours. Isolated roads. And in several cases, witnesses who described something unsettling, not an attack, not even a crime, just a feeling, like they were being watched. One report stood out. A woman, traveling alone in 1992, had called Highway Patrol after noticing a car following her at a distance for nearly 20 miles. It never attempted to pass, never got close enough to identify clearly, just stayed there, constant, controlled. When she finally pulled into a gas station, the vehicle drove off. She described it as a dark sedan. At the time, it was logged and forgotten. Now it felt like a rehearsal. Back in the present, investigators tracked every possible lead on Keegan's later life. He had moved frequently: Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, brief periods in California. Always temporary work. Always under the radar. Then, around the early 2000s, he vanished from official records. No death certificate. No confirmed relocation. Just an absence. The kind that could mean anything.
Dead.
Alive under a different name. Or still moving, still adapting, still unseen. That uncertainty changed the tone of the investigation. This was no longer just about solving a decades-old disappearance. It was about confronting the possibility that the person responsible had never been caught and might have continued. The weight of that possibility settled heavily over the task force. Because if Keegan was their man, then Laura Bennett wasn't just a victim of a single crime. She was part of something larger. Something that had slipped through every crack in the system for years. And then another shift. Not from the past. From the present. Forensic analysts, re-examining the physical evidence from Laura's car with modern technology, found something that had been overlooked, not because it wasn't there, but because the tools in 1993 weren't capable of isolating it. A partial print. Not clean. Not complete. But enough. It had been lifted from the inside edge of the driver's door. Positioned in a way that suggested contact during the moment Laura exited, or was forced out. Back then, it went nowhere. Now, it was run through updated databases, cross-referenced with millions of entries that didn't exist 3 decades ago. The process took hours. Then minutes. Then one result surfaced. Not a full match, but close. Close enough to narrow the field dramatically. Close enough to make one name rise above the rest. Thomas Keegan. The room went still. It wasn't confirmation. Not yet. But it was the first time his name had connected to physical evidence. The first time the case shifted from suspicion to something heavier. Something real. Investigators moved quickly, reopening warrants, coordinating across state lines, pushing through layers of bureaucracy that had once slowed everything down. They needed to find him, confirm the match, build the case, finally close the loop that had remained open for 30 years. But time had already done what it does best. It had erased paths, complicated truths, buried answers under layers of distance and decay. Because when they finally tracked down the last known location tied to Keegan, a remote property outside a small Nevada town, they found something that felt both like progress and another dead end. The house was abandoned, weathered, quiet, empty in a way that suggested it had been that way for years. Inside, there was nothing personal. No photographs, no documents, no signs of a life lived there recently. Just dust and absence. But in the back, partially concealed beneath warped floorboards, they found something that didn't belong to the emptiness. A box.
Old, worn, sealed.
The kind of object that doesn't exist by accident. And in a case that had survived on fragments and silence for decades, it felt like the first real answer was finally within reach. Or the beginning of something even darker. The box didn't look like much. No markings. No labels. Just aged wood. Edges splintered. The surface dulled by years of heat and neglect. It sat beneath the floorboards like it had always been there, like it belonged to the house more than to any person. But nothing about this case was ever that simple. When the lid finally came loose, the air inside carried a smell that didn't belong to dust or decay. Something older. Something sealed too long. Inside, order. That was the first thing that stood out. Not chaos. Not random clutter. Everything was placed deliberately, almost carefully, as if whoever put it there expected it to be opened one day, just not too soon. Photographs. Dozens of them. Faded, edges curled, some barely holding their color, but clear enough to recognize what they showed.
Cars.
Parked along empty roads. Different locations, different angles, but the pattern was unmistakable. Vehicles alone, isolated, vulnerable. Some with doors open. Some with lights off. Some with nothing visibly wrong at all. And in several of them people. Unaware. Captured from a distance. Watching without being seen. Investigators moved slowly, methodically, documenting every piece before touching anything further. Each photo was a fragment, a moment frozen. But together they formed something far more disturbing, a system. A method of observation. Selection. This wasn't impulsive. This was curated. Beneath the photographs, more items surfaced. Maps. Folded, worn, marked with circles and lines drawn in pen that had bled slightly into the paper over time. Highways. Back roads. Remote intersections. Patterns that traced movement across states. Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico. Looping, overlapping, repeating. Route 89 appeared more than once. So did areas where unsolved disappearances had been reported over the years. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately, was something smaller. Personal. A bracelet.
Thin. Silver.
Simple design. And attached to the inside clasp, engraved so lightly it could be missed unless you were looking closely, was a name.
Laura.
The room shifted the moment that name was read aloud. Not speculation. Not theory.
Connection.
For the first time, something tied directly back to Laura Bennett, something that had no reason to be there unless it had been taken from her. The case was no longer drifting between possibilities. It had direction. And that direction led straight back to Thomas Keegan. Forensic teams processed everything in the box with precision. Fingerprints, fibers, trace evidence, every surface examined, every item cataloged. Technology had advanced, but time had still done its damage. Not everything yielded results, but enough did. Partial prints matching the same profile found in Laura's car. Consistent. Reinforcing. Building weight. The photographs underwent enhancement, digital reconstruction pulling out details invisible to the naked eye, license plates blurred into readability, road signs clarified, landscapes identified. Locations were mapped, cross-referenced with historical data. Some matched known cases. Others didn't, which meant there were more. More incidents. More moments. More people who might never have been reported, never connected, never found. And through it all, one question grew louder. Where was Keegan now? Because everything they had uncovered pointed to one undeniable truth. This wasn't the work of someone who stopped easily. This was sustained, disciplined, repeated. And people like that don't just disappear without a reason. Investigators expanded the search outward, pulling in federal resources, issuing alerts tied to Keegan's identity, his known aliases, his behavioral patterns. Old contacts were re-interviewed. Financial trails, thin as they were re-examined under modern systems designed to catch what older methods missed. A ripple effect began.
Tips came in.
Some useless, some desperate, some driven by the kind of fear that resurfaces when a name attached to darkness is spoken again after years of silence. Then one stood out. A call from a small town in northern New Mexico. A mechanic. He didn't know Keegan by that name, but he recognized the face. Said a man matching the description had come through his shop years ago, late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Driving a dark sedan that had clearly seen better days. Engine problems. Overheating. He remembered the interaction because it felt off. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just controlled. Too controlled. The man didn't make small talk. Didn't ask unnecessary questions. Paid in cash. Watched everything closely, as if memorizing the space, the exits, the people. And before he left, he asked something that stuck. Roads around here, which ones stay empty the longest? At the time, it seemed like nothing. Now, it felt like a pattern repeating itself. Investigators traced that lead, mapping possible routes Keegan could have taken from that location, overlaying it with timelines of other disappearances, reports, sightings. The web expanded again, messy, incomplete, but undeniably connected. And then came the second call. This one quieter, more hesitant. A woman who said she wasn't sure if it mattered. Said she almost didn't call. But the name, the story, it brought something back. A memory she had buried. Years ago, driving alone at night, somewhere along a desert highway, she noticed a car behind her. Not close. Not far. Just there. For miles. When she slowed down, it slowed. When she sped up, it stayed. Never overtaking. Never leaving. Just present. Until suddenly it wasn't. Gone without explanation. At the time, she convinced herself it was nothing. Now, she wasn't so sure. Investigators logged it, added it to the growing collection of echoes that all pointed in the same direction, a presence that moved quietly, watched carefully, acted only when conditions were perfect. And Laura Bennett had been caught in that moment. The box had given them more than evidence. It had given them perspective. This wasn't chaos. It was design. And design leaves traces, patterns, habits, mistakes. Somewhere in all of it, Keegan had made one. He had to. Because no one operates in the dark for that long without slipping, even once. And when they found that slip, when they followed it to its source, the case that had been frozen for 30 years would finally reach something it had never had before. An end. Or something dangerously close to it. But for now, the desert still held its silence. And somewhere within that silence, the truth was waiting. The deeper they went, the less this felt like a single case. It started to feel like a map of something that had been moving for years, quietly, deliberately, always just outside the reach of attention. Every photograph from the box, every marked location, every witness statement layered on top of another until the pattern stopped looking accidental. It was movement with purpose. And now, for the first time, investigators weren't just reacting to the past. They were trying to predict it. They rebuilt Keegan's world from fragments. Not just where he had been, but how he thought. The routes he favored. The timing. The conditions he seemed to wait for. Late hours. Minimal traffic. Long, uninterrupted stretches of road where visibility worked both ways. You could see far enough ahead to prepare, but no one could see you clearly enough to stop you. He didn't hunt randomly. He selected. And that realization changed the strategy completely. Instead of only looking backward, analysts began projecting forward, identifying areas that fit the same criteria Keegan had used decades ago. Remote highways still lacking surveillance. Regions where traffic dropped to almost nothing after midnight. Places where a stalled car wouldn't raise immediate alarm. It was a dangerous assumption. Because if Keegan was still alive, if he had never truly stopped, then those places weren't just empty. They were opportunities. The task force coordinated with state patrol units across multiple jurisdictions, quietly increasing presence along those predicted corridors. Not enough to draw attention. Not enough to spook anyone who might be watching. just enough to disrupt the pattern. Because people like Keegan relied on consistency. And consistency, once broken, forces mistakes. Meanwhile, forensic teams kept working the evidence from the box, pushing beyond the obvious. Tiny fibers embedded in the fabric lining, dust samples trapped in the folds of the maps, even microscopic residues on the photographs themselves, anything that could anchor those objects to a specific place, a specific time beyond the broad estimates they already had. One result came back unexpected. A trace of industrial lubricant, rare, specific, not commonly found outside certain types of mechanical work. It matched compounds used in heavy-duty automotive repair, particularly older engine systems. That detail alone didn't solve anything. But combined with Keegan's known work history, construction, auto repair, transient mechanical jobs, it added another layer of consistency. He didn't just move through these environments. He belonged in them, which meant he could blend in easily. Ask questions without raising suspicion. Stay just long enough to learn what he needed and leave before anyone thought to remember his face. The investigation circled back to one recurring question. How many times had he done this? The box suggested multiple incidents. The maps suggested movement across years. The witness statements, scattered, incomplete, hinted at something broader. But there was no full count. No definitive number. Just gaps. And in those gaps the possibility that some victims had never even been reported. That thought lingered heavier than anything else. Because it meant Laura Bennett might not just be part of a series. She might be part of something far larger than anyone was ready to confront. Days turned into weeks as the investigation stretched outward, pulling threads from every direction. Leads overlapped, contradicted each other, collapsed, then resurfaced in new forms. The momentum was there, but so was the uncertainty. Until something shifted. Not from evidence. One of the patrol units assigned to a predicted corridor in northern Arizona reported something unusual. Not a crime. Not even a clear incident. Just a vehicle. Parked off the shoulder of a rarely used stretch of highway. Engine running. Lights off. The report came in casually at first. Routine. But the details they echoed too closely. Too familiar. By the time backup units arrived, the vehicle was gone. No plate captured. No clear description beyond dark-colored sedan. It could have been nothing. A coincidence. Someone resting. Someone lost. But in a case like this, coincidences start to feel like signals. Investigators didn't dismiss it. They expanded surveillance in that area immediately, adjusting patrol patterns, increasing coverage just enough to watch without being seen. And then silence again. Days passed.
No repeat sightings.
No new activity. The pattern, if it was one, had vanished as quickly as it appeared, which raised a more unsettling possibility. Someone had noticed. Because the one thing consistent in everything they had uncovered about Keegan was control. He didn't take risks without reason. He didn't stay where attention gathered. If he sensed a shift, if he saw something different in the environment, he would adapt. Or disappear. And that possibility forced the investigation into its most uncomfortable phase. They weren't just hunting someone anymore. They might have alerted him. The weight of that realization settled hard across the task force. Every decision now carried risk, not just of failure, but of pushing the target further out of reach. Because if Keegan was still operating, he now knew something had changed. Back in the evidence room, the bracelet sat under controlled light, its surface reflecting just enough to keep attention fixed on it. Laura's name, etched so faintly, felt louder than anything else in the case. It wasn't just proof. It was a reminder that this wasn't theoretical. This wasn't just patterns and projections and possibilities. A real person had been taken. A life interrupted in under 2 minutes on an empty road. And for 30 years, there had been no answer. Now there was almost one. Almost. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous place to be. Because close isn't enough. Not in a case like this. Not when the truth has spent decades buried in silence, waiting for the moment it's finally forced into the light. And somewhere beyond that light someone might already be moving again. The shift wasn't announced. No press conference. No official warning. Nothing that would alert the public, or the person they were now hunting, that the investigation had crossed a line it could never uncross. But inside the task force, everything had changed. They weren't chasing history anymore. They were watching for movement. Every patrol unit assigned to those isolated corridors understood the pattern now. Engine running, lights off, distance maintained, control above everything else. They weren't looking for reckless behavior. They were looking for patience, because that's what made this different. This wasn't chaos. It was restraint. And restraint is harder to detect. The first real break didn't come from a dramatic encounter. It came from something smaller, quieter, the kind of detail that would have been ignored in any other case. A traffic camera. Old. Grainy. Positioned miles away from the stretch of road where the recent sighting had been reported. It wasn't even meant for surveillance, just a basic monitoring system for traffic flow. Most nights, it recorded nothing but empty asphalt and the occasional passing truck. But on that night, at a time that aligned too closely to dismiss, it captured something. A car. Dark-colored. Older model. Moving slowly. Not unusual on its own. But the timing, combined with the location, placed it within a narrow window where it could have passed through the exact area patrol units had flagged just minutes earlier. The footage was enhanced, stabilized, pushed through every available system to extract details. License plate, partial. Make and model, estimated. Damage patterns, subtle, but present. Enough to build a profile. And when that profile was run against historical vehicle records tied to Thomas Keegan, it aligned. Not perfectly, but close enough to tighten the net. Investigators moved quickly, tracing possible registrations, cross-referencing ownership transfers, looking for any sign that a vehicle matching that description still existed, and more importantly, was still in use. One lead surfaced. A vehicle registered under a different name, an alias that had appeared briefly in connection with Keegan years earlier. The registration was recent enough to matter. Not current, but not old enough to ignore. It placed the car in circulation. Not abandoned. Not scrapped. Used. And that meant one thing. Whoever was driving it was still out there. Surveillance efforts shifted immediately. Focus narrowed. Patrol units adjusted positions, covering exit routes, monitoring fuel stations, rest stops, any location where someone moving through that region would need to pause, even briefly. Because movement always leaves traces. Even when someone is careful. Especially when they've been careful for a long time. Then came the second sighting. This time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't uncertain. A patrol officer, positioned along a secondary road branching off the main corridor, reported a vehicle passing at low speed, dark sedan, no headlights, engine barely audible over the wind. The officer didn't react immediately. That was intentional. Engaging too soon could spook the driver. Confirmed awareness. Break whatever pattern was unfolding. Instead, he waited. Counted seconds. Then pulled out slowly, maintaining distance, keeping the vehicle in sight, without closing the gap. The road stretched ahead, empty, cutting through open desert with nowhere to hide. For a moment it felt controlled. Predictable. Then the sedan accelerated. Not aggressively. Not panicked. Just enough to shift the balance. The officer followed. Distance held steady.
No sudden turns.
No erratic movement. Just two vehicles moving through darkness, one aware of the other, both locked in a silent calculation of space and timing. Then, without warning, the sedan turned off. Not onto a marked road. Not onto anything visible on standard maps. Just a break in the terrain. A narrow, unpaved path that vanished into the darkness beyond the headlights. The officer slowed. That decision point lasted less than a second. Follow or hold position. Protocol leaned toward caution. Unknown terrain. Unknown intent. Backup still minutes away. But this wasn't just any vehicle. This was a pattern. And patterns don't repeat like this by accident.
He turned in.
The path was rough, uneven, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Dust kicked up behind the patrol car, reducing visibility, swallowing the tail lights ahead in a shifting haze. For a moment, nothing. Then faint, just ahead, the glow of red lights.
Still there. Still moving.
The officer pushed forward, closing distance carefully, aware that any sudden move could trigger a reaction he couldn't control. The path curved. Visibility dropped. And then, the lights disappeared.
Gone.
Not dimmed. Not turned off gradually.
Gone.
The officer reached the curve seconds later and found nothing.
No branching paths. No visible turnoffs.
No structures. Just open desert stretching in every direction, illuminated by the harsh beam of headlights cutting through dust and silence. The sedan had been there seconds ago. Now it wasn't. Backup units arrived quickly, sweeping the area, expanding the search radius, scanning for tracks, disturbances, anything that could explain how a vehicle vanished in open terrain. They found tire marks.
Clear. Defined.
Leading straight ahead. And then stopping. Not fading. Not turning.
Stopping.
As if the vehicle had ceased to exist at that exact point. The scene locked everyone in place. Because it didn't make sense. Vehicles don't just disappear. Not like that. Not in terrain this exposed. Not without leaving something behind. But there was nothing. No continuation of tracks. No signs of reversal. No indication of a concealed path. Just an endpoint. And silence. The kind of silence that had defined this case from the beginning. Back in 1993, Laura Bennett stepped out of her car and vanished. Now, decades later, a vehicle tied to the prime suspect in her disappearance had done the same thing.
Different time.
Different place. Same absence. And suddenly, the investigation wasn't just about finding a man. It was about understanding how something could operate in plain sight for so long and still leave behind nothing but questions. The desert hadn't given up its secret. It had just reminded them how easily it could take something and keep it. The desert didn't make mistakes. That was the first conclusion they reached after the search turned up nothing, again. No hidden roads. No buried structures. No mechanical explanation for how a moving vehicle could simply vanish in open terrain. The tire tracks ended exactly where they ended, as if the ground itself had decided that was enough. But investigators didn't believe in impossibilities. They believed in things they hadn't found yet. By daylight, the scene looked different, but not less unsettling. The harsh clarity of the sun revealed every inch of the ground in brutal detail. No shadows to hide behind. No darkness to distort perception. Just dry earth, scattered rock, and the undeniable fact that a car had been there and then wasn't. They expanded the search radius. Drones swept overhead. Ground teams moved in coordinated grids, scanning for inconsistencies, depressions in the soil, subtle disturbances, anything that might suggest concealment. Hours passed, then more. And then someone noticed it. Not a track. Not a structure. A pattern. At first it looked natural, just another uneven patch in the terrain. But when viewed from above, it formed a shape that didn't belong. Too symmetrical. Too intentional. A faint outline, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. A rectangle. Large enough for a vehicle. The team moved in. Closer inspection revealed what time had tried to erase. Edges reinforced with compacted soil, traces of materials that had long since degraded, and beneath it all a hollow.
Not deep.
But enough. Carefully concealed. Designed to blend with the surrounding ground, to disappear under the same dust and wind that erased everything else out here. A trap. Or something very close to it. Excavation began immediately, controlled, methodical. Every layer removed slowly, documented, preserved. Because whatever was beneath that surface had been hidden for a reason. And whoever hid it understood exactly how to make things disappear. The first thing they uncovered was a metal. It was fabric. Faded. Fragile. But unmistakably human. Clothing. Buried just beneath the surface. Compressed by time. Stripped of color, but not of meaning. Forensic teams froze the scene, shifting into a different kind of precision, the kind reserved for moments when a case stops being theoretical. Because now they weren't just looking for answers. They were standing on top of them. The excavation went deeper. And then, Metal. The edge of a frame. Not intact. Not recognizable at first glance. But as more earth was cleared, the shape began to form. A vehicle, partially dismantled, deliberately broken down and buried piece by piece. Not dumped.
Placed. Hidden.
The realization hit all at once. The sedan hadn't vanished. It had been swallowed. By design. This wasn't a random escape. It was infrastructure. Pre-planned. Pre-built. Positioned in a location where no one would think to look unless they already knew something was wrong. And that meant one thing. Whoever had used this had done it before. The vehicle was pulled apart under forensic supervision. Every component cataloged, every surface tested. Time had degraded much of it, but not everything. Serial numbers, partial, but recoverable. Paint layers, consistent with the description from both the traffic camera and Daniel Harker's account. And inside traces, fibers, residue, microscopic evidence that told a story no one could ignore anymore. This was the car. Or one of them. Connected. Linked. Part of the same pattern that had stretched from 1993 to the present. But the most important discovery wasn't the vehicle. It was what lay beneath it. Because whoever built this didn't just plan for the car. They planned for something else. Something deeper. The excavation continued. The air shifted. No one spoke as the ground gave way to something that had been hidden far longer than the vehicle above it. The soil changed texture.
Density.
A subtle difference that forensic teams recognized instantly. Disturbed earth. Older. More compacted. And then bone. The first fragment surfaced in silence. Small.
Bleached.
Unmistakable. Everything stopped. Time stretched in that moment, heavy, suffocating, as the reality settled in. This wasn't just a disposal site for a vehicle. This was a burial site. Carefully chosen. Carefully concealed. And potentially used more than once. The excavation expanded outward, revealing more fragments, more evidence of human remains that had been placed here deliberately, layer by layer over time. Not chaotic. Not rushed. Organized. Controlled. The same pattern. Always the same pattern. Forensic teams worked through the remains with extreme care, reconstructing what they could, documenting positions, searching for identifiers, anything that could bring names back to what had been reduced to fragments. Because somewhere in that ground was Laura Bennett. Or, at least, the answer to what had happened to her. But as the remains were processed, another realization began to take shape. There was more than one individual. Not just one. Multiple. The scale shifted instantly. This wasn't a single crime scene. This was a site. A place that had been used repeatedly over years, possibly decades. The implications were staggering. Because it meant that everything they had suspected, the patterns, the movements, the possibility of multiple victims, was no longer theory. It was real. And it had been buried just beneath the surface the entire time. Back at the command center, the case transformed overnight. What had once been a reopened cold case was now an active, multi-victim investigation with forensic evidence linking directly to Thomas Keegan. The name that had lived quietly in forgotten reports was now at the center of something far larger than anyone had imagined. But one question still remained. Where was he? Because someone had built this, maintained it, used it, and then, at some point, walked away. Or moved on. And if Keegan had been the one using this site, then he had operated with a level of patience and foresight that made him more than just dangerous. It made him disciplined. Which meant he wouldn't stay in one place forever. He would adapt, relocate, start again somewhere else. And that possibility hit harder than anything else they had uncovered. Because if this site had remained hidden for decades, how many more were out there? The desert had finally given up one of its secrets. But in doing so, it had exposed something far worse. This was never just one disappearance. It was a system. And systems don't end easily. They evolve. And somewhere, beyond the reach of this excavation, beyond the stretch of Route 89 and the buried evidence now brought into the light, there was still a missing piece. A man who had spent years perfecting the art of vanishing. And who, even now, might already be doing it again. The moment the remains were confirmed as multiple individuals, the case stopped being contained. It spread across jurisdictions, across years, across every unsolved disappearance that had ever been dismissed as isolated, unfortunate, unconnected. What had once been separate files, stacked, forgotten, archived under different names, now began pulling toward a single center. One location, one pattern, one man. But even with the site exposed, even with the vehicle recovered, even with physical evidence tying everything back to Thomas Keegan, something still didn't fit. Because if this had been his primary disposal site, if he had used it repeatedly over time, then why abandon it? Why leave behind something so effective, so carefully designed, so hidden that it had gone undetected for decades? The answer came slowly. Not from the ground. From the timeline. Forensic analysis of the remains began producing estimates, windows of time based on decomposition, soil interaction, environmental exposure. Not precise dates, but ranges. Enough to build a sequence. And that sequence told a story no one expected. The site hadn't been used continuously. There were gaps. Long ones. Years where nothing had been added. Then activity again. Then silence. Then another cluster. It wasn't consistent. It was episodic. Like someone returning to the same place until they didn't. Until something changed. Investigators aligned those gaps with known movements in Keegan's life. Job changes, relocations, periods where his trail went cold or shifted across state lines. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to raise a disturbing possibility. He didn't stop. He relocated, which meant this site, this carefully constructed, deeply concealed burial ground, was just one chapter, not the whole story. That realization hit harder than the discovery itself, because it meant there were other places, other sites, still hidden, still waiting, and the only person who knew where they were was missing. The pressure intensified. Search teams expanded outward from the original site, scanning surrounding areas for similar patterns, disturbed ground, unnatural symmetry, anything that matched the structure they had uncovered. But nothing surfaced immediately. If there were other sites, they were better hidden, or further away. Meanwhile, identification efforts began. Each set of remains became its own investigation, DNA extraction, cross-referencing with missing persons databases, revisiting cases that had gone cold years, sometimes decades ago.
Families were contacted. Carefully.
Cautiously. Because hope and devastation often arrive together in cases like this. One identification came back first. Not Laura. Another woman. Missing since 1996. Last seen driving alone at night. Her case had never made national attention. Barely even local headlines. Just a brief report, a search that yielded nothing, and then silence. Until now. Her name was spoken again. Her story re-entered the world. And suddenly, Laura Bennett wasn't alone anymore. The pattern had a second face. Then a third. Each confirmation added weight. Added reality. Added a level of horror that no theory could match. Because these weren't just data points. They were lives. Interrupted in the same way. At the same kind of place. Under the same conditions. And each one reinforced the same conclusion. Thomas Keegan hadn't been lucky. He had been methodical. Back at the original site, one more discovery shifted the investigation again. Deeper beneath the primary burial layer, forensic teams uncovered something different, not remains, not vehicle fragments, but structure.
Wood.
Reinforced. Partially collapsed, but still intact enough to recognize. A compartment. Hidden below the burial site itself. It wasn't large. Not enough to store bodies. Not enough to hide a vehicle. Something else. When it was opened, the contents were sparse, but deliberate. A flashlight. Old, corroded, but functional at some point. A length of rope. And a small, sealed container. Inside the container, paper.
Notes.
Not detailed accounts. Not confessions. Just fragments. Observations. Times. Locations. Short phrases written in a controlled, almost mechanical handwriting. Late traffic minimal. Wind cover sound. Wait for isolation. It read like preparation, like reminders, like someone refining a process over time. But one line stood out above the rest, shorter than the others, written more heavily, as if pressed into the paper with more force. She ran. The room went still when it was read, because that wasn't just a note. It was a memory. And it matched exactly what Daniel Harker had described the moment Laura broke free, the moment she ran toward the road, toward the only chance she had. It confirmed everything, not just the method, the moment, the reality of what happened out there that night in 1993. For the first time, Laura's final seconds weren't abstract. They were real. And someone had written them down. Keegan had been there.
He had seen it.
He had remembered it. And he had carried that memory long enough to record it, then bury it beneath layers of earth, vehicles, and other victims. The case had crossed a line. There was no uncertainty left about who was responsible. Only one question remained. Where was he now? Because everything they had uncovered, the site, the vehicle, the notes, it all pointed to a man who planned ahead, who adapted, who didn't stay in one place long enough to be caught. And if he had abandoned the site, it wasn't because he was finished. It was because he had moved on. The task force expanded the search nationally. Every known alias, every past location, every possible connection pulled into a system designed to catch patterns across decades. Airports, bus routes, employment databases, anything that might reveal movement, anything that might show where a man like Keegan would go next. But the more data they processed, the more one possibility began to surface. Not as a conclusion, as a fear. What if he wasn't running? What if he wasn't hiding? What if he had simply stopped leaving traces? Because the most dangerous thing about someone who spends years perfecting disappearance is that eventually they don't just make others vanish. They learn how to do it to themselves. And if Thomas Keegan had reached that point, then the case wasn't just about finding him anymore. It was about proving he ever truly existed in the way they thought he did. Because out in the desert, buried beneath years of silence and dust, they had found what he left behind. But the man himself was still missing. By the time the excavation concluded, the full weight of the case hit everyone like a desert storm, unexpected, relentless, and impossible to ignore. The vehicle, the burial site, the remains, the notes. All of it painted a portrait of precision, patience, and meticulous control. But portraits don't capture the human cost, the lives reduced to fragments, the families who had waited decades for answers that never came. And even with the confirmation of Laura Bennett's connection, the truth wasn't comforting. It was a reminder. This man had thought decades ahead. He had calculated, observed, and executed a pattern so refined that for 30 years, no one had even suspected. The forensic analysis continued nonstop, blending old records with modern technology. DNA from the remains confirmed identities one after another, women, men, sometimes young adults, all with disappearances stretching from the early 1990s into the late 1990s. The scale was horrifying, but it fit the meticulous method suggested by the notes in the hidden compartment. Every detail reinforced the same narrative: control, observation, planning, nothing left to chance. Meanwhile, detectives revisited Daniel Harker's testimony from 1993. His account of seeing a car parked with lights off, a figure watching, then Laura fleeing, now read with a terrifying clarity. He remembered every detail but had felt dismissed for decades. Now, each element matched something in the forensic record: tire tracks, vehicle residue, placement of the box, even the small timing discrepancies of Keegan's pattern. What had seemed like vague, unreliable memory was suddenly a linchpin connecting decades of evidence. Every lead funneled toward one question: where was Thomas Keegan now? By now, the investigation wasn't just about reconstructing past events, it was about anticipating movement. Analysts created models predicting likely behavior. Areas with minimal oversight, isolated roads, temporary work locations, transient populations. They scanned financial networks, rental histories, employment records, even obscure online forums where someone like Keegan might attempt to blend in. Patterns emerged, but they were faint, intermittent, as though the man knew precisely how to vanish.
Tips started coming in.
Some were dead ends, vague sightings, or mistaken identities. Others carried a strange weight. A mechanic in Utah recalled a man matching Keegan's description, asking about routes far from populated areas. A truck driver in New Mexico remembered a dark sedan following him silently, never getting closer, never leaving. All of it traced the ghost of a pattern that had persisted for decades, leaving just enough traces to terrify, but never enough to capture. Then came the breakthrough, not a sighting, not a capture, but a connection. Investigators discovered an unregistered property just over the Arizona border, abandoned but showing subtle signs of recent use. Footprints, disturbed soil, and minor disturbances in dust layers suggested someone had returned recently. Surveillance began immediately. Drones, infrared cameras, and ground teams circled, but no one entered. Every movement in this area was calculated, deliberate, just like Keegan had always operated. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was tense. Analysts mapped every previous movement of Keegan, every disappearance connected to him, every potential site. Patterns over 3 decades now formed a mosaic of deliberate control, calculated timing, and absolute patience. The desert had been his ally, isolation, obscurity, and attention to environmental variables his weapons. Every layer of evidence confirmed a terrifying reality. Thomas Keegan had been operating with surgical precision, learning, evolving, adapting over 30 years. And now, perhaps, he was watching them watch him. At night, the silence was deafening. No vehicle, no footsteps, nothing, just the wind, shifting sands, and a task force aware of the predator they were chasing. Every patrol felt like a potential encounter, every shadow a possibility, every signal a clue. The desert, relentless and neutral, offered no mercy. And yet it hid him. But the evidence never lies. The vehicle fragments, the burial site, the bracelet engraved with Laura's name, the hidden compartment, the notes, all of it pointed to one individual. Keegan had left a trail over decades, designed to reveal just enough to confirm control but never enough to be caught. The realization was chilling. He wasn't just a killer. He was an architect of absence. He had built systems of disappearance, teaching the desert to swallow people and erase evidence as if it were natural law. Even with the evidence, even with the confirmed identifications, the most haunting aspect remained. The man had never been seen, never caught. Every move investigators made risked pushing him further out of reach. The sites they uncovered were historic, past patterns. But the present? That was unknown. And that uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. Families of victims began receiving word. Closure, partial as it was, arrived with a mixture of relief, grief, and fear. They learned that Laura Bennett's disappearance was no random event. It had been part of a pattern, one that had stretched across states and decades, a calculated orchestration of isolation and control. And while evidence had finally surfaced, the person responsible remained beyond grasp, a ghost hovering at the edges of the investigation. The city, the desert, the long stretches of empty highway, they all held their breath. Because one thing was clear, Thomas Keegan had been meticulous, patient,
strategic.
And anyone who thought the story ended with the discovery of the box and the vehicle fragments underestimated him. He had spent decades perfecting disappearance, and the world now knew he could vanish again. The case had revealed the past. It had connected the dots, identified victims, established methods, confirmed timelines. But it had not captured him. And in that ungrasped absence, the tension, the horror, and the suspense didn't fade. It only grew, leaving the investigation dangling between revelation and uncertainty, between justice partially served and the terrifying knowledge that the architect of these vanishings might still be out there, moving, watching, adapting. The desert had finally given up its secrets, layer by layer, but one secret remained: Thomas Keegan himself.
Hidden.
Elusive. Beyond capture. And in that enduring silence, the echoes of a cold case stretched through decades, chilling, relentless, impossible to ignore. By now, the task force had begun to understand the true scale of what they were facing. The desert had surrendered fragments, vehicles, remains, notes, maps, and patterns, but it had not surrendered him. Thomas Keegan remained a ghost in plain sight, a master of disappearance, a figure who had orchestrated decades of vanishings with precision so meticulous that only hindsight revealed the depth of his craft. Every piece of evidence told a story of control, patience, and the ability to adapt, to exploit isolation, and to remain invisible even when investigators were scouring the land he had mastered. The discoveries in the hidden compartment, the notes about timing, traffic, wind, and observation, revealed a man who calculated everything, anticipated variables, and left nothing to chance. She ran. One note read, confirming Laura Bennett's desperate final moments. That single line was more than a memory. It was proof that Keegan had been present, had observed, and had meticulously recorded the events of that night. It was chilling, intimate, and clinical, a window into a mind that could both plan and destroy without hesitation. Investigators understood that every movement in the present could alert him. He had spent decades perfecting a system of control, predicting patterns, calculating human behavior, and leveraging isolation to his advantage. This wasn't just a serial offender, it was a strategist, someone who treated disappearance as an art, a science, and a game. Every search team, every patrol, every surveillance drone was now part of a puzzle he had anticipated. The pattern analysis suggested he had abandoned the burial site deliberately. The gaps in the activity indicated strategic pauses, relocations, and perhaps periods of dormancy. But one fact was undeniable. He would continue adapting, relocating, and exploiting vulnerability. The desert had been his laboratory, highways his observation posts, and human lives his variables. Investigators had the past mapped. They had reconstructed decades of disappearances. But the present? That remained elusive. Families began to hear the truth. One by one, identifications confirmed decades-old losses. Some were greeted with relief, a chance for closure long delayed. Others arrived with grief, a harsh reminder of the scope of Keegan's crimes. Laura Bennett was part of a system that stretched beyond what anyone could have imagined. The knowledge brought clarity, but also fear. And through it all, the specter of the man who orchestrated it lingered, unresolved, untouchable, and still terrifying. Even as evidence piled up, the vehicle fragments, remains, maps, and notes, the realization persisted. The case was solved only in part. The method, the victims, the timeline, these were now understood. But Keegan himself had never been captured. He had moved in the shadows, mastered concealment, and survived by adapting faster than law enforcement could respond. The desert may have revealed the mechanisms of his crimes, but it refused to give up the man who created them. Every step forward carried tension. Every pattern observed suggested both opportunity and danger. Analysts predicted potential movements, calculated possible hideouts, but all they could do was anticipate a predator who had spent decades staying one step ahead. The haunting truth settled across the task force and families alike. Keegan was still out there, capable of reappearing anywhere, invisible in plain sight, and always watching. The Arizona desert remained silent. Highways stretched into darkness. Abandoned rest stops, empty parking lots, and isolated roads carried the echoes of a past filled with disappearances. And somewhere, beyond the reach of search teams and surveillance, the architect of those vanishings persisted, a reminder that the resolution of a cold case does not always bring justice, only fragments of it, and the lingering awareness that some shadows are not meant to be caught. The evidence told the story. The victims' identities returned to the world. But the perpetrator, the man who had manipulated space, time, and human perception for decades, remained absent. The city, the desert, and the families of the lost had answers, but not closure. They had narrative, context, and understanding, but not the final confrontation that would deliver the sense of completion the human mind craves. And in that absence, the cold case retained its final, chilling power. A long-lost witness had changed everything, uncovering patterns that had been hidden for decades, yet the man responsible remained at large, as elusive, calculating, and present as ever. The desert had revealed its past, but it had not released its ghost. Thomas Keegan's shadow stretched across Arizona, over decades, through lives taken, through patterns repeated, through silence unbroken. The case was solved in parts, but the ultimate truth, the confrontation, the reckoning, remained just out of reach. And so, the story ended, not with justice fully served, not with a predator caught, but with a lingering, unmistakable truth. The desert keeps its secrets, and some ghosts refuse to be found. The echo of the Arizona cold case stretched forward, carrying the weight of lives lost, the terror of what had been, and the haunting possibility of what could still be. Even as the dust settled over the excavation site, the weight of what had been uncovered pressed down like the relentless Arizona sun. Forensic teams had cataloged remains, analyzed fibers, traced vehicle fragments, and reconstructed decades of patterns, but the man who orchestrated it all, the ghost at the center of this labyrinth, remained unseen, unbroken, untouchable. Every piece of evidence, every note, every mapped route led back to him, yet the final confrontation, the one that could close 30 years of uncertainty, hadn't come. And with each passing day, that absence became its own force, pulling at investigators, haunting the families, and echoing through the empty highways that Keegan had once claimed as his own. Analysts pored over his known habits again. The timing, the location, the meticulous observation of isolation points, it all suggested he had learned from decades of evasion. The desert had been his laboratory, but perhaps now he had moved beyond it. Somewhere, beyond state lines, beyond immediate detection, Keegan existed not just as a criminal, but as an enduring enigma, a presence that could not be predicted with certainty. The psychological profile painted a man who thrived in invisibility, who measured every risk, who calculated even the most basic human responses. And that insight, though terrifying, was the only weapon investigators had against a predator who had outlasted time itself. At the command center, new leads flickered in, tips from across the Southwest, sightings reported in small towns, anomalies in vehicle registrations, patterns in financial transactions that might be connected, but each thread unraveled before it could be followed. The man who had once left tiny breadcrumbs for investigators to eventually uncover was now entirely off the grid. Or, more accurately, he was operating exactly as he always had, quietly, deliberately, invisibly. Each lead felt like a whisper from a ghost, confirming that while the past had been uncovered, the present remained unknowable. Families of the victims wrestled with conflicting emotions. Relief that their loved ones' disappearances had been explained. Horror at the scope and method of the crimes. Frustration that the person responsible had eluded justice. Closure existed in fragments, identities restored, patterns understood, histories written down, but the absence of the perpetrator made it incomplete. And every conversation, every interview, every visit to the site of the excavation reminded everyone involved that the danger, while dormant, might still exist. Investigators began shifting from reactive measures to long-term surveillance and predictive monitoring. Highways, remote rest areas, small towns along historic routes used decades earlier, they were watched in a continuous, careful cycle. Analysts tracked subtle anomalies, quiet patterns, anything that might suggest Keegan was preparing to move again. Even so, they understood the stakes. He didn't need to be present to remain dangerous. A predator who had survived 30 years by staying one step ahead of law enforcement could have learned to manipulate environments, influence witnesses, and exploit systems while remaining invisible. The psychological toll on the task force was real. Months of reconstruction, forensic analysis, and pattern recognition had built a deep understanding of Keegan's mind, a mind that was patient, controlled, and relentless. But understanding someone intellectually did not translate to apprehension. He was a master of adaptation, able to move through years and decades, through the changing landscape of law enforcement, without ever being caught. Each discovery reminded the team of the stakes, a man who could kill and vanish with precision, whose methods were sophisticated enough to confound even modern investigative technology. And yet, there was a glimmer of strategy in their frustration. Every piece of evidence, every recovered item, every note in that hidden compartment revealed a methodical, repeatable process. Patterns could be mapped. Habits could be anticipated. If investigators could find a thread long enough to trace it, if they could predict even a fraction of his calculated movements, there might be a chance, a slim, dangerous chance, to catch him. The desert continued to watch. The highways stretched on endlessly. Small towns slept under the cover of darkness, oblivious to the presence of a man whose reach, his system of disappearance, had extended decades into the past and remained active in the present. And while the cold case had been solved, in the sense of identifying victims, mapping patterns, and confirming methods, the human story, the confrontation, the reckoning, the face of the man behind the terror, remained unresolved. Somewhere, Thomas Keegan existed beyond the reach of the law, beyond the boundaries of the evidence, continuing to move with the same patience and precision that had defined his decades-long campaign of vanishings. He was no longer just a name in a cold case file. He was a living reminder that some predators are not constrained by time, by location, or even by visibility. They exist in the spaces between, in the silence of empty roads, in the shadows where vigilance falters. The Arizona 1993 cold case had revealed its secrets, layer by layer, decade by decade. Yet the ultimate truth, the man himself, remained unclaimed. Justice had been partially served through the identification of victims and the unraveling of method, but the ghost at the center of the labyrinth still walked unseen, silent, and ever watchful. And in that enduring absence, the story, the terror, and the mystery of Thomas Keegan persisted, a chilling testament to the fact that some shadows are impossible to fully illuminate. The case ended not with resolution, but with awareness. The victims were no longer forgotten. Their stories were known, their names restored. But the architect of their disappearances, the long-lost presence that had controlled fate for decades, remained free, a reminder that even when the past is uncovered, the present can hold dangers still unseen. The cold case was solved in evidence, in understanding, in fragments, but in the ultimate sense, the ghost of Thomas Keegan remained at large, and the desert still whispered his name. The silence of Arizona stretched wide, the highways empty, the desert vast, and somewhere, a man who had mastered disappearance waited, unseen, patient, and perfectly adapted. The long-lost witness had changed everything, revealed decades of hidden truth, but some mysteries do not end. They linger, they haunt, they endure, and some ghosts refuse to be caught. Even as the task force wound down the excavation and forensic analysis, the atmosphere didn't lighten. The discoveries, the vehicle, the buried remains, the notes in the hidden compartment, all confirmed the truth of what had happened, yet they also illuminated the terrifying precision of Thomas Keegan's methods. Every detail, every careful arrangement, every layer of soil over the years was a testament to a mind that understood not just disappearance, but control itself. And while evidence had finally surfaced, the man who orchestrated it all remained absent. The realization settled like dust on the desert floor. The case was solved in evidence, but not in confrontation. Investigators pored over the recovered notes again, focusing on timing, environmental variables, and specific observations. They were fragments of a larger strategy, reminders that Keegan had meticulously recorded and refined his process over decades. The words she ran resonated like a pulse through the investigation, a human heartbeat captured in ink, a cruel acknowledgement of resistance, of chance, of a life almost escaping but ultimately controlled. Each note, each observation was a window into his mind, calculating, patient, unflinching. As months passed, the task force shifted strategies from reactive searches to predictive modeling. Analysts studied decades of movements, looking for correlations in geographic patterns, vehicle sightings, and employment histories. Every anomaly, every outlier in records, was scrutinized. The desert highways, abandoned parking areas, and transient population centers were mapped and monitored, the web of observation expanding outward like the invisible reach of a predator who had learned to remain unseen. But for every lead, there was frustration. For every potential thread, Keegan had adapted, disappeared. The ghost of decades past now controlled the present. Families continued to navigate the complex mixture of relief and horror. Identities were restored, and victim stories were rewritten into the world, but the man responsible had eluded capture. Partial closure arrived in fragments. They could mourn with certainty, they could mark the truth of what had happened, yet the ultimate reckoning remained out of reach. The specter of Thomas Keegan hung over every conversation, every search, every moment of reflection. He was a shadow both remembered and unseen, a presence whose absence was more tangible than any evidence could provide. Then came subtle clues almost imperceptible. An unregistered vehicle spotted near a remote highway, a fleeting shadow on surveillance footage, small disturbances in soil near historic patterns of activity. Each sign was tentative, fragmentary, but it confirmed the terrifying possibility that Keegan had not stopped. He had only adapted. The patterns of his past could predict behavior in theory, but not with certainty. He was still in motion, and his mastery of disappearance allowed him to slip between decades, states, and patterns without ever being detected. The psychological weight on investigators became acute. Decades of observation, forensic reconstruction, and data analysis provided understanding, but no satisfaction. Keegan was more than a killer. He was an architect of absence. Each step of the investigation revealed how he had manipulated space, time, and human attention to ensure invisibility. Every layer of evidence was proof of his intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. And yet, no amount of planning or prediction could guarantee that he would be found. He had become a ghost whose methods transcended traditional investigation. In parallel, investigators traced the timelines of the burial site, the notes, and recovered materials. Patterns emerged that suggested episodic activity, intervals of apparent dormancy, relocations, periods of observation and study. Each gap, each pause in activity, was deliberate. And each suggested that the site, though uncovered, was only part of a larger system. Keegan had created infrastructure for disappearance, and evidence indicated he had done so repeatedly, at multiple sites, with meticulous attention to concealment and timing. The desert, once a hiding place, had been a stage for a long-term experiment in evasion. The task force also began revisiting unsolved disappearances nationwide, connecting that previous investigations had never linked. Missing persons reports from decades ago, dismissed as isolated or accidental, began aligning with the methods, vehicles, and environmental patterns Keegan had exploited. Each connection expanded the scale of his influence, revealing a system that spanned states, decades, and populations. The evidence was irrefutable. Thomas Keegan had operated with precision, patience, and intelligence unmatched by law enforcement's attempts to apprehend him. And yet, for all the revelations, one fact remained undeniable. Keegan was free. He had survived decades of scrutiny, changing names, locations, and methods, always one step ahead. The desert had given up its historical secrets, the victims had been identified, and the forensic record was complete, but the man himself remained unclaimed. The case, while technically solved, retained its tension, its threat, and its unanswered questions. His absence amplified the haunting reality. Knowledge of the pattern did not equal control over the predator. The Arizona cold case, once thought closed, now existed in two forms. One in evidence, meticulous, layered, undeniable. The other in absence, elusive, adaptive, and persistent. The discoveries had rewritten the history of disappearances, confirmed the fates of victims, and revealed the mechanisms of one of the most patient predators imaginable, but they had not captured the central figure. That remained a shadow in the desert, a presence outside the reach of law enforcement, a ghost whose mastery of invisibility defined both the past and the potential present. And so the story of Thomas Keegan endures, a calculated, patient architect of disappearance, a man whose system of control had spanned decades, whose presence had been observed only through the remnants he left behind, and whose absence, paradoxically, became the most tangible evidence of his power. The Arizona cold case was solved in fragments, in method, in the recovered lives and objects, but the ultimate resolution, the confrontation, and the justice that could fully close the story remained suspended, haunting, and chillingly alive. The desert remained quiet. The highways stretched into emptiness. And somewhere beyond surveillance, beyond observation, beyond prediction, Thomas Keegan continued to exist, patient, adaptive, invisible. The cold case had revealed decades of hidden truth, but some shadows are eternal, and some ghosts refuse to be caught. Even as the sun rose over the desert, illuminating miles of empty highway and jagged ridges, the shadow of Thomas Keegan loomed larger than ever. Investigators had the evidence, the recovered vehicle fragments, the buried remains, the notes, and the documented timelines that stretched across decades. They had reconstructed a narrative of chilling precision, mapped the patterns, and confirmed identities. But the man at the center of it, the predator who had orchestrated all of it, was nowhere to be found. Every discovery only underscored the terrifying reality that Keegan had mastered disappearance itself. He had not only evaded capture, he had refined the art of invisibility into a long-running system that law enforcement was still trying to understand. With each recovered fragment, each note detailing timing, wind, and traffic, the scale of his meticulous planning became clear. She ran, one note recorded, a line that captured Laura Bennett's desperate moment of defiance and encapsulated the cruel efficiency of Keegan's control. The vehicle, dismantled and buried in layers of desert soil, revealed a man who anticipated every possibility. The evidence didn't just prove what happened. It demonstrated that Keegan had thought decades ahead, leaving behind just enough trace to terrify, but never enough to be caught. Investigators extended their reach beyond the desert. Every state, every highway, every transit hub was analyzed, as patterns from the past suggested potential present activity. Old aliases, employment records, and transient behaviors were scrutinized. Subtle anomalies in vehicle registrations, temporary addresses, and financial transactions were flagged. The idea was simple, terrifying. If Keegan was still active, even in small ways, any lapse could reveal him, but he had spent decades ensuring no lapses existed. He had studied patience, invisibility, and timing to near perfection. Families were contacted carefully as identifications trickled in. Relief mixed with grief, closure mingled with horror. Laura Bennett's story became part of a larger mosaic, one that stretched across decades and multiple victims. Each identification reinforced the reality of a methodical predator who had operated with ruthless patience and exacting control. But the ultimate figure, the one responsible, remained absent, a ghost haunting both investigators and communities. The hidden compartment beneath the burial site had revealed something extraordinary, a mind at work, constantly analyzing, recording, and refining. Notes on timing, traffic, and observation revealed not just actions, but intentions. A man who could calculate a night, a stretch of road, a sound, a moment of human fear, and then manipulate it to his advantage. The same man who had orchestrated disappearances in 1993 had refined those methods for decades, adapting as patterns of law enforcement changed. The desert had been his training ground. The world beyond now represented only new challenges to be outmaneuvered. And yet, despite all that knowledge, he remained unseen. Surveillance yielded nothing concrete, only faint anomalies that hinted at movement. Investigators understood that predicting his next move was a dangerous exercise. One wrong assumption could allow him to vanish again. Every step forward required caution, patience, and careful coordination. The desert, silent and vast, remained both witness and accomplice. It had revealed its historical truths but refused to give up the living ghost who had mastered it. The psychological toll was immense. Years of analysis, decades of reconstruction, and the awareness of a predator still at large weighed heavily on every member of the task force. Keegan was no longer just a suspect. He was a study in persistence, a demonstration of control, and a reminder that some threats cannot be neutralized by conventional methods. Evidence could reconstruct the past, identify victims, and confirm methods, but it could not capture the man himself. The task force began to think in systems: predictive monitoring, pattern recognition, geographic modeling. They accounted for every known variable: isolated roads, transient populations, environmental conditions, historical behavior. Each model suggested possible locations, potential movements, and behavioral tendencies. But Keegan was adaptive. He had evolved with each new method of detection, each advance in law enforcement. The desert and the highways had been his classroom, and he had graduated. And in that silence, in that vigilance, in that endless desert landscape, one truth became chillingly clear. The cold case had been solved in evidence, in method, and in understanding, but not in justice. The architect of decades of disappearances had been exposed, but not captured. His patterns were known, his victims identified, his methods revealed, but the man himself was still out there, watching, moving, calculating. The Arizona 1993 cold case had changed forever. Long-lost witnesses had brought truth to light. Decades of disappearances were connected, and the hidden mechanisms of a master predator were laid bare. Yet the ultimate confrontation remained beyond reach, the final reckoning postponed indefinitely, and the desert, with all its open roads and empty horizons, remained a place where ghosts walk freely. Thomas Keegan had been revealed, understood, and feared, but he had not been caught. The case, in all its complexity, had reached a terrifying equilibrium. The past was exposed, the victims remembered, the methods known, but the predator endured. And somewhere, in the shadows of highways and the silence of the desert, he waited, patient, invisible, and perfectly adapted, a living testament to the chilling reality that some ghosts refuse to be caught.